That's a lot of dinks.
New York City in the early 90s was a heavy place. Crime was at an all-time high. The streets were loud, tense, and weary. Because the city was recording thousands of homicides a year, the people who lived there had developed a thick skin. They were used to a certain level of daily danger. But beneath all the familiar noise, a quiet shadow was moving through Brooklyn and Queens, and this brought a completely different kind of feeling to the streets. It all started on a cold night in November of 1989. A strange letter arrived at a police precinct in Brooklyn. Inside, someone had drawn a circle cut into 12 slices, like a pie chart of the Zodiac. Next to it, they wrote, "The first sign is dead." The writer claimed to be the infamous Zodiac killer from California, returning after 20 years to start a new tally on the East Coast. The police didn't take it seriously at first. In the neighborhood handling constant emergencies, a weird letter just seemed like a hoax from someone looking for attention. So they filed it away. They didn't know that the clock had already started ticking. 4 months later, the shadow struck. It was a Thursday morning around 2 o'clock. A man named Mario Ozoko was walking home from his job washing dishes. The man walked with a severe limp. He also used a cane. He was just a few blocks away from home when somebody came up behind him in the dark. No words were spoken. The stranger shot him once in the back and then ran away. Mario survived, but the bullet stayed in his spine. His sign was Scorpio. Exactly 21 days later, on another Thursday morning, it happened again. A man was shot in Jamaica, Queens. He survived. His sign was a Gemini. 21 days after that, an elderly man named Joseph Prost was standing on his front stoop. A young guy would walk up and calmly ask him for a glass of water. When Joseph told him to go to his own apartment, he turned around. The stranger then shot him in his back. Joseph would die weeks later. Joseph was a tourist. On the front steps, police found a note held down by 3 small stones. It had the same circle symbols from before. The message boasted that 3 signs were now dead. The city then realized that this wasn't just random street violence. This was somebody keeping a calendar. When the New York Post published the letters on the front page, the feelings on the street shifted. New Yorkers were used to the usual dangers of the era, but the idea of someone tracking people based on their birth certificates brought a strange and psychological anxiety. A quiet tension began to break at the outer boroughs. People started changing their routines. On the trains and buses, strangers would strike up casual conversations. And if somebody asked, "What's your sign?" the air in the room would suddenly turn to ice. People would begin lying about their birthdays to strangers. Tip lines began to be flooded with calls from citizens reporting anyone who seemed a little too interested in astrology. The police will create a massive task force. They flooded the street on those 21-day intervals, hiding in unmarked vans and waiting for Thursdays to roll around. But the killer also knew they were watching, so he changed his route. He went into Manhattan, right into Central Park. One night, a homeless man was sleeping in the park bench when the killer shot him in the back. Besides the victim, police found another note pinned under a stone. Experts would check the handwriting against the old California Zodiac, and it didn't match. So this wasn't the old killer from the 60s. This was someone new, a copycat, working by his own rules. And for a long time, detectives were desperate. They even talked to astronomers to figure out the dates. They soon discovered that the killer was timing his attacks to the stars. 2 independent detectives on the task force decided to follow an entirely different trail. They looked away from standard police forensics and they turned to the occult. The investigation led them to the Central Research Library. They looked for the text of Aleister Crowley and his teachings on the celestial skies. These detectives began tracking the specific constellation patterns of Orion and the Seven Sisters. They got the help from people from the Hayden Planetarium, who mapped out the history of the night sky for them, using a powerful computer to trace the alignment of the stars over New York. This is when they discovered that the nights the killer skipped were nights when those specific constellations were completely invisible in the eastern sky. The killer, he was timing his attacks to a map drawn in the heavens. But then, the sky went dark. The letters stopped, the dates passed, and nothing happened. The task force would eventually break up, and the shadow went underground. But when you look into this case, you see the killer and look at his portrait, you'll see a portrait of deep isolation. Eddie Sater. Eddie, he lived in completely isolation. He didn't work, he didn't have friends, and he spent almost all his time trapped inside a tiny bedroom in Brooklyn. When the U.S. Army rejected him, it broke his sense of future, so he retreated inward. He began reading about past cases, and he began planning. Eddie was also a deeply religious man, but in a highly personal, fractured way. He read his Bible constantly, and he looked at the world through a lens of judgment. In his own mind, he cast himself as someone cleansing society. He targeted individuals on the fringes, the elderly, the disabled, and the homeless. For a person who felt completely invisible and powerless in his daily life, holding a weapon gave him an absolute sense of control. But even after police finally caught him years later, and even after he confessed to the shootings, one deep mystery remained. Sater would never explain how he knew his victims' zodiac signs. To this day, nobody knows how he did it. The police checked every angle. Did he stalk them for weeks beforehand, learning their personal details? Did he check their IDs in the seconds after the shooting? Or did he just ask them a casual question on the streets before pulling the weapon? When the detectives pushed him for answers in the interrogation room, Sater would clam up. He refused to say a word about it. Investigators believed that this was his way of keeping one last piece of control, leaving the secret that they could never figure out. In the end, it was a domestic dispute that brought things to a halt. In June of 1996, Eddie got into a fierce fight with his sister inside their apartment and shot in the back. He managed to escape and call the police. When the cops arrived, Eddie started a massive shootout, running from window to window, firing homemade weapons he built out of plumbing pipes and rubber bands. A hostage negotiator would come in to talk him down. By pure coincidence, it was the exact same detective who spent years hunting the New York Zodiac. And after 3 hours of talking through the door, Eddie finally surrendered. At the station, they told Eddie to write down a statement about why he shot his sister. And at the bottom of the page, he drew the same circle with the crosshairs. Detectives looked at the paper and knew instantly. They matched his fingerprints, and the puzzle was finally solved. Eddie Sater was then sentenced to 200 years in prison, and that's where he lays today. The lasting impact he left in New York City isn't one of grand mystery, but a rather quiet observation about isolation. He showed how easily a person working in the dark can wrap their own personal grievances into a larger mythology. Today, the panic he caused has faded into the history of a city that has seen a great deal. The streets got quiet again, and the stars over Brooklyn went back to being just stars, cold, distant, and still.